What if everything you believed about getting old was wrong? That question played like a stubborn echo in Frank Reynolds' mind as he sat in the dim light of his garage, staring at the same broken wall clock that had hung there since the summer of '89. The second hand was stuck, twitching forward, always retreating, like it was trying to move on but couldn't. The same could be said of Frank. It was a Wednesday. Or a Thursday. It didn't really matter. At 68, the days had started to blend into each other like fog rolling across an empty field, slow, shapeless, and quietly suffocating. He sat in his usual spot, an old metal stool with one leg that wobbled, watching dust motes float through a sunbeam slanting in from the cracked window. The air smelled like oil, pine, and the ghost of dreams too long buried. Somewhere in the background, the local news droned on about a city council budget debate that no one under 70 cared about. Frank didn't even notice it anymore. The garage was his escape, but lately, it had started to feel more like a tomb. Shelves filled with rusting tools lined the walls. A broken vice grip. Old bolts in a Folgers coffee can. An unopened box labeled Kyle, High School. He never had the heart to open that one. A single light bulb hung from the ceiling like a forgotten idea. That was when his phone buzzed in his shirt pocket. He ignored it. Probably spam. But then it buzzed again. And again. With a grunt, he pulled it out, thumbed the screen, and saw the notification from YouTube. Elon Musk says retirees are the most wasted potential in society. The thumbnail showed Musk mid-sentence, eyes lit up like always, a streak of unfiltered electricity behind them. Frank stared at the words. He didn't know why, but he tapped it. The video started, and Elon was talking fast, like usual, jumping from thought to thought like stepping stones across a river of fire. People think retirement is the end. I don't buy that. I think it's when most people finally have the freedom to think boldly, but society tells them to shrink. That's backwards. You're not done at 65. You're just finally unchained. Frank blinked. Something stirred, a flicker of warmth buried under layers of apathy and cholesterol. He set the phone down and stared at the corner of the garage where his old drafting table leaned against the wall, untouched for decades. Back in '72, when Apollo still echoed in young men's chests and everyone wanted to be an astronaut, Frank used to draw rockets. Big ones. Wild ones. He'd wanted to be part of NASA. Heck, he even got accepted into a pre-engineering program after high school. But then life happened. Vietnam. Bills. Marriage. A factory job. Then management. Then retirement. Then, nothing. Elon's voice still filled the space around him. Don't let the world tell you you're finished just because you have gray hair. If you have time and curiosity, you can build anything. Frank felt a tremor in his fingers. Not fear. Not arthritis. Something else. He stood slowly, knees popping, and shuffled to the drafting table. It was covered in dust. Like everything else. He brushed it off with a rag. Beneath the grime was a sketch, his sketch, of a lunar lander with his name signed in the bottom right corner, F. Reynolds, 1974. He chuckled softly. His wife, Marlene, used to joke that the moon would be closer than fixing their bathroom plumbing. She'd been gone 6 years now. Cancer. Took her like a thief in the night. He traced the lines of the drawing with one finger, like he was touching a ghost. Then he walked over to the far shelf and opened an old metal toolbox. Inside were pencils, calipers, a compass, all untouched since 1983. He took out the pencil, twirled it in his hand like he used to, and opened a fresh page on a yellowed pad. He started sketching. At first it was just lines. Then curves. Then something strange and sharp and beautiful began to take shape. The Starship. Elon's Starship. Towering. Sleek. Improbable. He wasn't trying to invent something new. just trying to remember how it felt to dream. Outside, a neighborhood kid zoomed by on a scooter, shouting into the wind. Inside, Frank breathed in deeply. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a chore to breathe. He sat down at the table and kept drawing, stopping only when the pencil tip snapped. That night, he didn't turn on the TV. He didn't scroll through reruns. He didn't even microwave his usual frozen lasagna. He just sat in the garage, surrounded by rocket blueprints and memories he thought were lost forever. Before bed, he scrolled through YouTube and clicked subscribe on the SpaceX channel. Under the comments section, his fingers hesitated, then typed, "I'm 68. Just started building again. One small step for me." He hit post. A minute later, a reply popped up, "That's amazing, Frank. Where you watching from?" Others followed, "You're never too old to dream. You just inspired my dad to start woodworking again. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?" Frank didn't answer that one. Not yet. He shut off the phone and looked up at the ceiling. The garage seemed warmer. Bigger, somehow. Like a ship preparing for launch. Something had shifted. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just, real. The moment it all changed didn't come with trumpets or flashing lights. It came with a whisper, a pencil stroke, and the voice of a man who refused to believe in limits. Frank Reynolds didn't know exactly what he was building yet. But for the first time in a long time, he knew it mattered. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Reynolds woke up before the sun, like he always did. His body didn't need alarms anymore, it ran on stiffness, on creaking joints, on habit formed over 4 decades of early shifts at the plant. He swung his legs over the side of the bed slowly, like a diver preparing for cold water. The carpet under his bare feet was threadbare, the room dim and familiar, filled with things that hadn't moved in years. A lamp shaped like a crescent moon sat dusty on Marlene's old nightstand. Her robe still hung on the back of the closet door, untouched. He never moved it. Never could. He made his way to the kitchen, the house quiet except for the ticking of the wall clock and the occasional groan of the old furnace. He poured coffee from the same pot he'd used since '92, the handle still cracked from that one Thanksgiving Kyle had dropped it. Kyle. The name alone was a weight pressing on his chest. He hadn't spoken to his son in over 2 years, not since their last phone call ended in something that started as frustration and ended in silence. Frank stirred in powdered creamer, watching the swirl like a galaxy folding in on itself. He remembered when the house had been filled with noise, Kyle's music blasting from upstairs, Marlene humming in the kitchen, laughter during Sunday games. Now, silence was the loudest thing he heard. After breakfast, he stepped into the garage, the air cooler there, heavier. The Starship sketches from the night before were still on the table. He ran a hand over the paper, smudging a pencil line. It felt both ridiculous and sacred. He sat back down, picked up the pencil again, and kept drawing. He lost track of time, only noticing the shift in light when a sunbeam hit the aluminum canister on the shelf, casting a silver glow across the table. In that light, the line seemed to come alive. He saw it clearly now, the fins, the curve of the nose cone, the booster base. He remembered watching early SpaceX tests on TV, back when everyone laughed at them. Rockets exploding, flames shooting sideways, reporters calling Elon Musk a billionaire lunatic. But Frank hadn't laughed. He'd admired the persistence. The refusal to quit. The willingness to look foolish in pursuit of something larger than life. That was something he used to understand. Back in high school, he'd spent hours poring over popular mechanics magazines, cutting out blueprints, designing his own launch pads. He wanted to be part of NASA. He wanted to make things that reached the stars. He was good at math, better with his hands. His guidance counselor told him he had a shot at the local engineering program, and he believed it. For a little while. Then came the draft. Then came his brother's accident. Then his father's stroke. Then responsibility. College faded like fog in morning light. He took a job at the factory to help cover medical bills. He got promoted. Then promoted again. Then he met Marlene. Then Kyle was born. Life moved. One day he looked up and 30 years had gone by. The dreams didn't vanish all at once. They eroded, piece by piece, replaced by grocery lists, mortgage payments, car repairs, and insurance premiums. He had a good life, but not the one he once imagined. And after retirement, it was like falling off the edge of a map. No purpose. No orders. Just long days and longer nights. At first, he tried hobbies. Gardening. Fishing. But nothing stuck. Nothing sparked. Until now. Until the whisper of something wild returned. He looked at the sketch again and felt it in his chest, a flicker of the boy he used to be. That kid who wore NASA patches on his denim jacket and snuck out to watch moonrises from the roof. The kid who believed he could matter. A knock on the garage door startled him. It creaked open, and there stood Mason, the 12-year-old neighbor with hair like a haystack and energy like a shaken soda can. "Hey Mr. Reynolds, my mom said I could come help with the rocket." Frank blinked. "Help?" "Yeah. I saw your video. The one with the drawing. My brother showed me. You're building a real spaceship, right?" Frank chuckled softly. "Something like that." Mason stepped inside without waiting for permission, eyes wide. "Is it gonna fly?" "Nope. Just for show." "Cool. Can I help?" Frank hesitated. He hadn't invited anyone. But Mason was already poking around, picking up scrap metal and pointing at sketches. Frank sighed. "You know anything about blueprints?" "I build stuff in Minecraft." Frank smiled. "Close enough." The hours passed differently with Mason there. Faster. Louder. The kid asked a million questions and offered even more ideas. Some of them ridiculous, like mounting a soda fountain in the rocket, but Frank didn't mind. He hadn't had real company in months. That night, after Mason left, Frank sat alone again in the garage, but it felt different now. Warmer. Less hollow. He picked up his phone and looked at the comments on his post. There were dozens. Then hundreds. People from all over the country. "I'm 74 and just started painting again. My grandpa was a machinist too, he'd love this. Started walking every day after watching your video." Frank didn't know what to make of it. He wasn't used to being seen. He wasn't used to mattering. He scrolled until he saw one comment that stopped him cold. "Wish my dad would do something like this instead of watching TV all day." It hit like a stone. Because he knew that feeling. That desire to see someone you love come back to life. He wondered if Kyle felt that way. He wondered if maybe there was still time. Frank opened a drawer and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside were photos. One of him and Marlene on their wedding day, she in lace, him in a ridiculous mustache. One of Kyle at age 6, holding a model rocket they built together, both of them grinning like fools. One of his retirement party, where he faked a smile while wondering what the hell he'd do next. He stared at that last one for a long time. He looked tired in it. Faded. Like a man closing a book with no sequel. But maybe that wasn't true. Maybe retirement wasn't the end. Maybe it was just the intermission. Maybe Elon was right, maybe the most wasted potential in society wasn't the young who never tried, but the old who were never told they still could. Frank picked up the phone. Scrolled to Kyle's name. Hovered his thumb over the call button. Then stopped. Not yet. He needed to finish something first. Something that showed who he really was. He went back to the table, sharpened his pencil, and began the next set of sketches: internal supports, rivet points, height scaling. The kid might call it silly. His daughter might worry. But for the first time in years, he had somewhere to be. He had work to do. And it mattered. The man he used to be wasn't gone. He'd just been waiting. Waiting for a voice loud enough to wake him. Waiting for permission. Waiting for a mission. And now he had one. Build the rocket. Light the fire. Chase the dream. Not to fly. Not to escape. But to prove something, for himself, for Mason, for Kyle. For every person who ever looked in the mirror and saw more past than future. Frank Reynolds wasn't done. He was just getting started. The rain came down hard that morning, hammering the garage roof like a steady drumbeat of doubt, and Frank Reynolds sat in his truck watching the windshield wipers swipe back and forth like some kind of countdown. He had driven to the hardware store parking lot, engine idling, list in hand, but hadn't gotten out yet. Something about the idea of walking in there, gray-haired and stiff-limbed, buying steel piping and aluminum sheets to build a rocket in his garage just felt absurd. He could already hear the cashier's voice in his head. "That for a school project, sir?" Or worse, "Good for you." That's cute. That word, cute, made his teeth clench. There was nothing cute about being 68 and realizing you were terrified of being laughed at again. Not because of how it would look, but because of how much it would hurt. He turned off the truck and stared into the rain. He didn't know why this mattered so much. Or maybe he did. It was about time. The years that slipped past like a river you can't dam. The ones he spent pushing dreams aside because other people needed him. The ones that bled into each other after retirement, each day asking the same question: what are you still doing here? The doctor last year had told him to slow down. High blood pressure. Early arthritis. Take it easy, Frank. You've earned it. Earned what? An empty house and reruns of shows he'd seen 100 times. He finally stepped out of the truck and walked into the store, pushing his cart slowly down the aisles. Screws. Nuts. Sheet metal. PVC for structure. A welder he couldn't quite afford but put on his card anyway. The young man at checkout asked if he needed help loading. Frank said no. He still had his pride. Back home, Mason was waiting on the porch in a raincoat, backpack slung over one shoulder. "You get the nose cone." Frank smirked. "Close enough." They spent the afternoon in the garage, rain pattering above as they took measurements and lined up their materials. Frank was surprised at how steady his hands were when focused. His joints still ached, but his mind buzzed with clarity. Like it used to. Like it hadn't in decades. That night, alone again, Frank sat at the table eating soup from a can and scrolling his phone. He didn't recognize himself in this moment: sore muscles, paint on his jeans, thinking about aerodynamics like it actually mattered. He clicked on a podcast interview with Elon Musk, hoping for more fuel. The host asked, "What do you say to people who think it's too late to try something new?" Elon didn't pause. "That's fear talking. Not time. You're not too old, you're too scared of looking stupid." Frank exhaled, slow and heavy. That line hit hard. He was scared. Not of failure, but of being irrelevant. Forgotten. He remembered his last Thanksgiving with Kyle. They'd sat at the table, just the two of them, the silence thicker than the turkey gravy. Kyle had talked about his job, marketing, strategy, something Frank never really understood. Frank had tried to share an old story from the plant. Kyle looked up from his phone once, nodded, and went back to scrolling. That was the moment. The moment Frank realized his stories didn't matter anymore. That he was background noise. Just another old man who didn't know when to stop talking. He hadn't blamed Kyle. Not really. The world moved on, fast and bright, and Frank had stood still. But now, for the first time in a long while, he was building something that could catch up. The next day, Frank posted a short video on TikTok. Today we started framing the Starship base. Not bad for an old man and a kid with a scooter. The video got 1,000 views by the afternoon. Mason called it "Old Man Viral." Frank laughed so hard he choked on his coffee. Comments poured in again. People wanted updates. Some even offered to send parts or tools. A retired engineer in Florida offered to review the plans. It was exhilarating. It was terrifying. He felt like he was becoming visible again, and that came with pressure. He hadn't felt pressure in years. The local news called the next morning. A young reporter named Tasha asked if she could do a story. Frank said no at first, then Mason convinced him. Come on, this could be huge. What if Elon sees it? Frank rolled his eyes but said yes. The interview was awkward. Frank stumbled over his words, felt self-conscious about his thinning hair, but Tasha was kind. She focused on the heart of it, why an old man was building a rocket in his garage. Frank said, because I want to see if I can still build something that matters. The clip aired that night. The headline, Retired Machinist Builds Starship in Backyard, and a Second Chance at Purpose. Kyle didn't call. But he texted, saw the news. That's unexpected. You serious about this? Frank stared at the message. His fingers hovered over the reply. He typed, deleted, retyped, and finally sent, as serious as I ever was about anything. No reply came. But it was a crack in the ice. Later that week, Frank and Mason faced their first real setback. The booster frame collapsed during a test fitting. Metal warped. The weld cracked. Mason looked devastated. We ruined it. Frank shook his head. No. This is part of it. Part of what? Building. Dreaming. Failing. Getting back up. Mason stared at him, then nodded slowly. They rebuilt it over the next 2 days. Stronger. Smarter. Together. As they worked, Frank told stories, about the factory, about Marlene, about Kyle. Mason listened, really listened, like no one had in years. At one point, Mason asked, "Do you miss her?" Frank didn't answer right away. He wiped his hands on a rag and looked up at the ceiling. Every day. But she'd be proud of this. He pointed to the half-finished Starship. She always said I needed something to light me up again. Frank kept working, fueled by something deeper than nostalgia. This was a mission now. Not to fly to Mars, but to prove that life could still surprise you. That you could be more at 68 than you were at 38. That relevance wasn't reserved for the young. The real battle wasn't in his bones or his heart. It was in his mind. The voice that kept asking, what's the point? The fear that whispered, no one cares. But every line he drew, every bolt he turned, every comment from someone who said they were inspired, those were his weapons. And he was starting to win. He remembered Elon's quote again, scrawled on the notebook beside his tools, when something is important enough, you do it, even if the odds are not in your favor. Frank didn't know the odds of finishing this thing. Or whether Kyle would ever really understand. Or whether he'd live long enough to see it all done. But he was doing it anyway. Because it mattered. Because he mattered. And that was enough to keep going. Frank Reynolds stood in aisle 17 of the electronics surplus store, staring at a row of old circuit boards like they were artifacts from a forgotten age. He ran his fingers along the cool metal shelf, unsure whether he was here because he needed a specific part or because the place just felt alive with possibility. The store smelled like ozone and solder, humming with the faint buzz of ancient tech and buzzing fluorescence. A kid behind the counter, maybe 25, looked up from a dog-eared copy of Wired magazine and called out, "You building something cool, sir?" Frank opened his mouth, hesitated, then said, "A spaceship." The kid chuckled but not cruelly. "Awesome. Like a model?" Frank nodded slowly. "Let's call it that." He left with a box of mismatched wiring, a soldering iron, and something that looked like it belonged inside a microwave but might be useful for the landing leg simulation Mason wanted to rig up. Back home, the garage had transformed into what Mason called mission control. The old shelves were now stacked with labeled parts, sketches were pinned to the walls, and Frank had cleared off the dusty workbench that had once held Christmas decorations and forgotten plumbing tools. The rocket itself was still just a base frame, but it was real, taking shape inch by inch. And every inch meant something. Mason was waiting outside when Frank returned, waving a new phone tripod like a trophy. "We're filming today. Build log number 3. This one's going to be good." Frank rolled his eyes, but inside, he was a little excited too. They filmed as Frank connected the lower fins to the base, explaining why angle mattered, how real Starship prototypes used grid fins and cold gas thrusters, and why balance was everything in a launch. He didn't think anyone would care. But the comments said otherwise. "This guy is like Bob Ross but with rockets. My dad and I watch every episode together. Please keep going. Reminds me of my grandfather. He used to build with me too." The numbers ticked up. Thousands of views. Then tens of thousands. One night, Mason burst into the garage yelling, "Mr. Reynolds, you got shared by everyday astronaut." Frank had no idea what that meant. Mason explained it like it was a NASA mission brief. "He's a huge space YouTuber. Elon follows him." Frank blinked. "Elon?" Mason nodded vigorously. "Yes. Elon Musk. The man. The myth. The algorithm." Frank chuckled. "Well, guess we'd better make this thing look good, then." He didn't say it out loud, but something had shifted. The rocket wasn't just a personal project anymore. People were watching. People were cheering. And that did something to a man who'd spent the last decade being politely ignored. Still, not everyone was on board. His daughter, Emily, called one evening, voice sharp with concern. "Dad, are you really trying to build a rocket in your garage?" Frank sat down on the front step, phone pressed to his ear, the sun setting behind the pine trees in a blaze of gold. "Not a real one," he said. "Just a replica. Something to do." She sighed. "I just worry you're, overdoing it." "Emily," he said quietly, "I've been underdoing it for 10 years. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she said, You haven't sounded this alive in a long time. I guess I'm not used to it." He smiled. "Me neither." She didn't push. Just said, "Be careful. And drink water." Frank promised he would. The next morning, he walked into the garage and paused. Something felt different. Like crossing some invisible line between hobby and mission. He pulled out the original sketch, the one from the night he'd started this, and pinned it above the bench. Then he drew a circle around the words he'd scribbled in the corner, "Don't shrink." He took that as a sign. A challenge. He wasn't going to just build a sculpture. He was going to build an experience. He began researching LED setups to simulate launch lights. He found an old smoke machine at a garage sale and spent 3 days fixing it. He ordered a second-hand Raspberry Pi and spent long hours teaching himself how to program basic sequences. Mason helped where he could, mostly filming and drilling and occasionally offering opinions that made Frank laugh out loud. "Let's make it say something when you push a button. Like, 'Prepare for liftoff, Commander Frank.' How about 'Get off my lawn'? Even better. The garage became a place of invention again. A place of joy. But also of reckoning. One afternoon, while sorting bolts, Frank found an old lunchbox tucked behind a stack of toolboxes. Inside was a Polaroid of him and Kyle, maybe 10 years ago. They were in the garage, both wearing safety goggles, holding up a crooked birdhouse. Frank remembered that day. Kyle had just started college. They'd barely seen each other since. He stared at the photo a long time. There was something painful about it, how close they looked, and how far away that felt now. He opened his phone and scrolled to Kyle's contact. Still no reply to the last text. He considered sending another. Thought better of it. Back to work. Back to the rocket. The next build log hit 50,000 views in 2 days. Frank's follower count exploded. Journalists started emailing. One offered to fly out for a documentary. Frank said no. He didn't want this to be about clicks or clicks alone. He wanted it to be about the spark. About building again. About not fading. One night, after Mason left and the tools were put away, Frank stepped outside and looked up at the stars. They were sharp and bright, the sky clear enough to make him feel like he was floating. He remembered watching moon landings on a black and white TV with his dad. Remembered feeling like anything was possible. That maybe he'd get there too someday. And maybe he hadn't. But he'd found something better. A way back to purpose. A way forward. He whispered to the stars, "Thanks, Elon," and chuckled at himself. It felt ridiculous. But it also felt right. The next morning, he began cutting the nose cone. It was difficult, precise, frustrating work. His arms ached. His back protested. But he kept going. Because with every screw, every measurement, every spark from the welder, he was putting himself back together. Not just the rocket. Not just the past. But the man he wanted to be again. And he was almost there. It started with a message at 6:12 a.m. The phone buzzing against the metal workbench just as Frank Reynolds was wiping oil from his hands and sipping the first half cup of lukewarm coffee that had become his daily ritual, the screen lighting up with the kind of notification that didn't make sense at first, not in the bleary-eyed dawn haze of an old man's routine, and when he tapped it open, blinking twice, he thought maybe it was spam, maybe it was a fake, maybe he'd finally gotten scammed by one of those bots Mason warned him about, but no, it was real, it was verified, it was a message from SpaceX's official community team that read simply, "Hi Frank, we've been following your progress online. Elon saw your last video and shared it in our internal Slack. Would you be open to a short video call next week?" Frank sat down hard on the stool, the one with the uneven leg that always rocked slightly when he shifted weight, and stared at the message, rereading it 4 times, heart thumping louder than the ticking clock above the garage door, louder than the radio humming softly in the background, louder than any rational thought in his head, because this wasn't just the fantasy of a retired machinist building a rocket replica in his garage with a middle schooler. It was now something more, something bigger, something real, and it scared the hell out of him, not because he felt unworthy but because he didn't know how to explain why it meant so much to him in the first place, didn't know how to put into words the fact that this ship wasn't just fiberglass and welding joints, it was grief and lost years and a lifetime of things unsaid. It was his way of whispering back to the universe, "I'm still here." So he didn't reply right away, he just stared, letting it sink in, letting the edges of possibility curl around the familiar outlines of fear, until finally, slowly, he tapped out a reply, "Yes, I'd be honored, thank you for noticing." He didn't tell Mason right away because he didn't know what to say, didn't want to jinx it, didn't want it to become a thing until it was real, so he kept it to himself for the day, focusing on refining the thruster simulation system they'd been working on, which involved a ridiculous setup of garden hoses, steam vapor, and synchronized LEDs Mason had programmed to pulse when Frank hit a hidden switch on the base of the fuselage, and when they tested it that afternoon, the effect was stunning. Light poured through the undercarriage vents in timed pulses, smoke hissed out in dramatic bursts, and for a moment, as Frank watched the simulated liftoff flicker to life, he didn't feel like a man playing pretend. He felt like a man building a legacy, or maybe reclaiming one he never got to finish, and he smiled, not just with his mouth but with his entire soul, a full-body kind of smile that hurt his cheeks and brought tears to the edges of his eyes, not because of the smoke but because for once, it all worked, it all felt right, and Mason screamed, "We did it," as if they'd actually broken orbit. That night, Frank sat in the quiet of the garage, lights dimmed, ship looming over him like a cathedral of second chances, and pulled out the small notebook he'd started keeping beside the workbench, a gift from Mason that said, "Commander's Log," in shaky handwriting on the cover, and he wrote simply, August 12, rockets almost complete. Lights work. Steam system works. Got a message from SpaceX. Don't know what comes next. But I feel ready. For once, I feel ready. 2 days later, the video call happened. It wasn't Elon, not directly, but it was two people from SpaceX Media, one woman named Julia and a man named Ahmed, both young, both friendly, both visibly excited to talk to the retired guy with the rocket in his garage, and Frank felt strangely calm as he sat in front of his daughter's old laptop with Mason hovering just out of frame, feeding him sticky notes with reminders like, "Smile," and "Don't swear," and "Tell them about the landing gear," and for 15 minutes, Frank told them his story. Not the polished version, but the real one, about the dreams he had as a boy, the factory work that filled his middle years, the death of his wife, the silence that followed retirement, and the night Elon's voice cracked open something in him, something that said, "You're not done," and how he picked up the pencil again, then the wrench, then the torch, and started building not because he wanted to go to Mars but because he wanted to remember what it felt like to want something again, and Julia's eyes welled up, and Ahmed grinned wide, and they said, "We're going to send you something," and Frank didn't ask what, didn't press, he just said, "Thank you for reminding me that it's never too late," and they smiled and said, "No, thank you, Frank." After the call, he sat back, exhaled hard, and Mason hugged him, which surprised them both. The story hit Twitter that weekend. SpaceX shared a short clip from the interview with the caption, "At 68, Frank Reynolds is building a Starship in his garage to remember who he was, and who he still wants to be. Age is not the limit. Doubt is." It went viral. Within hours, the comments came flooding in again. "My dad's 70 and just started welding again. I cried watching this. Thank you, Frank. Elon, meet this man." And then, the moment Frank never expected, Elon himself retweeted it, adding just 3 words, "This guy rocks." Frank stared at the screen in disbelief. It didn't feel real. None of it did. But it was real. The rocket was real. The tools in his hands were real. The messages were real. The tears were real. And maybe most of all, the hope was real. That afternoon, Frank opened the wooden box again, the one with the old photos, and stared at the picture of Kyle with the birdhouse. Then, on impulse, he took a photo of the nearly finished Starship, opened a blank text message to Kyle, and typed, "I wanted to show you what I've been working on. You used to help me build things. I miss that. I miss you." He hovered for a long moment, thumb trembling, then pressed send. No reply came that night. Or the next. But 3 days later, at 7:04 p.m., his phone buzzed. The message said, "Saw your video. That's incredible, Dad. I'm proud of you." Frank read it 3 times. Then, finally, he let the tears come. Not quiet ones. Not polite ones. But sobs, deep and shaking, the kind that clean something out of you, the kind that make room for something new to grow. Mason found him sitting in the garage, still holding the phone, tears streaking down his cheeks, and didn't say a word. Just sat beside him, quietly. The rocket stood over them, tall and silver and bold, and Frank whispered, "I thought it was the end. But it's just the beginning." And Mason nodded. Because somehow, even he knew, this wasn't just about metal or space. It was about coming back to life. About breaking through. About finally, truly, launching. Frank Reynolds stood on the small wooden step stool beside the upper hull of his Starship replica, tightening the last silver bolt into the rim of the hatch cover as Mason adjusted the tripod camera angle from the other side of the garage, and there was a strange feeling in Frank's chest that he couldn't quite describe, something between pride and disbelief, because as he looked down at what they had built, a towering 12-foot-tall structure of brushed aluminum panels, steel ribs, fins angled just right, LEDs wired to pulse in sequence, landing legs rigged to extend on cue, he felt like someone who had climbed a mountain and only just realized how far he'd come, how high he'd managed to get after being stuck for so long at the bottom of something invisible and heavy, something that didn't have a name but had always whispered, stay still, stay small, stay safe, and now, standing on that stool, with sweat on his forehead and calluses on his hands, Frank whispered back, not anymore. The rehearsal was Mason's idea. We need a full systems test, he'd said, arms crossed like a miniature mission commander, and Frank had agreed even though he knew none of it actually did anything in the scientific sense. This rocket wasn't going to fly, wasn't going to break orbit, but it did something else, something he now believed might matter more. It lifted people emotionally, it ignited possibility, and right now, he realized, that included himself. They had spent the entire week preparing for this test. Mason had rewired the smoke system, adjusted the LED intervals to mimic actual launch sequences, and added a voice modulator that now triggered a countdown in Frank's own recorded voice, deep and gravelly, saying, T-10 seconds to liftoff, followed by a rising whine that simulated engine ignition. Frank had fine-tuned the landing legs timing system, so they would deploy slowly and deliberately like the real ones on SpaceX's Falcon 9 boosters, and even added reflective decals to the side of the ship to catch light in the dark. It was theatrical, sure, maybe even a little silly, but it was also something else, intentional, ambitious, alive. All systems ready. Mason called out from the side wall where the remote switch panel was mounted on an old corkboard. Ready, Frank said, stepping down from the stool, wiping his hands on a rag. Okay, launching in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, Mason flipped the switch. The garage lights dimmed automatically. Then came the voice, T-10 seconds to liftoff. A low hum built from the speakers Frank had mounted under the platform. Lights along the fuselage flared on, one by one, racing upward in rhythm. The smoke machine hissed to life, spewing white fog around the landing gear. Mason clapped his hands once, hard. It looks real. He shouted over the noise. Frank watched, stunned, as the garage transformed into a launch pad. For 60 full seconds, the lights pulsed, the smoke swirled, and the Starship glowed like it was about to lift off from concrete and fly right through the ceiling. Then it faded. The lights dimmed. The smoke cleared. Silence returned. Frank looked over at Mason, who was still grinning like Christmas morning. That, the boy said, was epic. And Frank laughed, a deep, belly-shaking, eyes-watering laugh that felt like it belonged to a man 30 years younger, and when he finally caught his breath, he walked to the center of the garage, put his hand on the side of the Starship, and said softly, "You're ready." Mason tilted his head. "We're ready," he corrected. And Frank nodded. "Yeah. We are." Later that night, Frank sat alone on the back porch, the chill of early September creeping into the breeze, a blanket over his knees, the stars above brilliant and sharp, and he thought about how far things had come since that night he first picked up the pencil and drew that sketch, how what began as a quiet, almost private rebellion against decay had become something shared, something powerful, something that people from all over the country, and even other parts of the world, were now watching, cheering for, connecting with. The comments hadn't stopped. "My husband started woodworking again because of you. I showed your rocket to my high school class, we talked about aging and dreaming. Thank you for reminding me that my story isn't over." Frank didn't feel like a hero. He still woke up with sore knees. Still forgot where he left his reading glasses. Still missed Marlene every single night when he turned out the light. But he also now woke up with purpose. He had something to do, something to look forward to. That mattered more than he'd ever guessed it could. The next morning brought a surprise, an email from the local museum. They'd seen the story. Wanted to know if he'd be interested in displaying the replica once it was finished. Frank stared at the message for a long time. He hadn't thought about what came next. Part of him wanted to say yes immediately. Another part wasn't sure he was ready to let it go. He hit reply and typed, "Let's talk." He wasn't ruling anything out anymore. That afternoon, while he was touching up the paint on the Starship's side panel, his phone buzzed again. This time, it was Kyle. Thinking about coming down for a weekend. Maybe check out the garage. Is that cool? Frank stared at the words. Read them 3 times. Then typed back, slowly, "That's more than cool. That's perfect." He felt something shift inside him again. Not a breakthrough like before, but a softening. A healing. Something old repairing itself without fanfare. He put the phone down and kept painting. The sun streamed in through the open garage door, light catching the curve of the rocket's hull. It gleamed like a silver memory. A few days later, Mason arrived with a stack of hand-painted mission patches he'd made on sticker paper. "I thought we should brand it," he said, handing one to Frank. It was a circle with a rocket in the center, and the words Reynolds Starship Initiative in bold around the rim. Frank smiled, peeled one, and stuck it on the control panel. Perfect. They made a final video together, launch test, behind the scenes, Mason interviewing Frank. "What would you tell someone your age who thinks they're too old to start something like this?" Mason asked, holding the mic up like a real reporter. Frank looked into the camera and said, "I'd tell them you're not too old. You're just waiting for permission that no one's going to give you. So give it to yourself. Today." Mason looked at him, silent for a beat, and then whispered, "That's the best answer you've ever given." Frank smiled. "It's the truest one I've got." That night, they uploaded the video with the title, "Final Launch Test, Reynolds Starship Initiative," and within 24 hours it had 500,000 views. People everywhere were sharing it. News outlets picked it up. The local museum confirmed they wanted the rocket on permanent display. And Frank? He just kept working. Smoothing the last edges. Polishing the surface. Planning where he'd stand when Kyle walked into the garage and saw it for the first time. The rocket was almost complete. But something inside Frank already was. Frank Reynolds didn't sleep much the night before Kyle was set to arrive. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan spinning slowly, his thoughts turning in time with it, slow, heavy, uncertain. He hadn't seen his son in almost 4 years, not in person anyway, not since that Thanksgiving dinner that had gone quiet after 15 minutes and ended with nothing but hollow goodbyes and a Tupperware full of untouched green beans. Since then, it had been missed birthdays, unread texts, and the empty ache of a father who didn't know how to reach across whatever space had grown between them. But now, there was something different in the air, something hopeful and terrifying, like the final moments before launch, when everything feels impossibly still and impossibly full of power at the same time. That morning, Frank got up before sunrise, brewed a fresh pot of coffee, then went out to the garage while the sky was still a dull gray. The rocket stood silent in the corner, tall and silver and gleaming faintly under the shop lights. He walked around it slowly, wiping dust off the landing gear, checking the wiring for the LED strip Mason had rewired last week, straightening the Reynolds Starship Initiative decal on the fuselage. It didn't need fixing, he just needed to keep his hands busy. At 9:03 a.m., Frank heard a car pull into the driveway. He froze. His hands clenched and unclenched. He heard a door shut, footsteps on gravel. Then, his son's voice, quiet, unsure, deeper than he remembered. "Hey, Dad." Frank turned slowly. Kyle stood at the garage entrance, wearing jeans and a plain blue hoodie, a duffel bag slung over his shoulder. His face looked older, tired maybe, but familiar in a way that hit Frank right in the chest. "Hey," Frank said. For a moment, neither moved. Then Kyle stepped in, his eyes sweeping the garage, and finally landing on the rocket. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "You weren't kidding." Frank gave a small smile. "Told you I was serious." Kyle walked slowly toward the Starship, circling it like he was approaching something sacred. "It's incredible. You actually built this?" "Me and Mason. He's at school right now. He'll be bummed he missed your arrival. I can come by again tomorrow." The words came easily, but Frank could tell they carried weight. That simple promise, "I'll be here tomorrow," felt like a rope thrown across a canyon. "You want the tour?" Frank asked. Kyle nodded. For the next hour, Frank walked his son through every part of the build. He showed him the landing legs, the steam machine, the control panel with the countdown voice modulator, even the Raspberry Pi Mason had programmed to simulate flight paths. Kyle listened closely, nodding, asking questions, smiling in that cautious way people do when they're not sure if something is real or just a moment they'll wake up from. "I remember when we built that birdhouse," Kyle said at one point, pointing to the shelf where the old photo still sat in a dusty frame. "You let me use the drill. I thought I was hot stuff." Frank chuckled. "You were. I just pretended to help." Kyle looked down for a second, then back up. "I'm sorry, Dad. For a lot." Frank felt something loosen in his chest, like a screw he hadn't realized had been tightened for years. "Me too," he said. "I should have reached out more. Should have listened more." Kyle stepped closer to the rocket, running his hand along the cold metal. "Why'd you build this?" Frank hesitated, then said quietly, "Because I needed to believe I could still create something. That I wasn't done yet. That life still had something for me." Kyle didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was low. "I think I forgot that about you. I always thought of you as this stable guy. Strong. Unchanging. I didn't realize you had dreams too." "Yeah, well," Frank said with a wry smile, "turns out old dogs can still dream." They both laughed, and the sound filled the garage with something warm. That afternoon, they worked side by side for the first time in years. Kyle helped Frank polish the top fin, then reprogrammed the voice countdown system to include a second voice, Mason's, so now it alternated between T-10 seconds to liftoff in Frank's voice and Commander Mason, systems are go in Mason's. Frank could hardly believe how naturally it all came back, the rhythm, the teamwork, the quiet comfort of building something with someone who used to be part of your everyday life. When Mason arrived later that day and saw Kyle, his eyes widened. "You're his son?" Kyle grinned. "Guilty." "Dude," Mason said, "I've heard so much about you. Welcome to the crew." They spent the next 3 hours together, tweaking the lighting, setting up the camera angles for what Mason now called the final cinematic launch. Frank watched them work, 2 generations with greasy hands and focused eyes, and felt like he was seeing something he'd given up hoping for. That night, the 3 of them sat on the porch, watching the stars. "You think we'll make it to Mars?" Mason asked. "Eventually," Kyle said. "I don't know if we should," Frank added. Mason looked at him, confused. "But you love space." "I do," Frank said. "But space isn't what saved me. This is." He gestured toward the garage. "The building. The connection. The purpose. Mars is great. But you don't have to leave Earth to find something worth chasing." Mason nodded slowly. Kyle leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, looking at the sky. "You're right," he said after a while. "You found something people spend their whole lives looking for." Frank looked at his son, silhouetted in the starlight, and felt something settle into place. Not fixed, not perfect, but peaceful. That night, just before bed, Frank opened the commander's log and wrote. September 10th, rocket ready. Systems green. Kyle's home. The real launch already happened. I just didn't know it at the time. The next morning, they ran one final full launch sequence. Mason manned the cameras. Kyle stood beside the control board. Frank took his place beside the fuselage. As the countdown began, and the lights flared, and the fog rose, Frank didn't just see a replica ship coming to life, he saw a lifetime of waiting, hesitating, and holding back finally breaking free. The voiceover played, T-minus 10 seconds to liftoff. Then Mason's voice, Commander Mason, systems are go. Then silence. Then light. Then motion. Then something that wasn't just a simulation anymore. It was real. Not in the way a spaceship becomes real. But in the way people do. When they decide they're not done dreaming. When they come home to each other. When they look at something impossible and say, why not me? The rocket didn't leave the garage that day. But Frank did. A different man than the one who first stepped in months ago. Because sometimes the launch isn't the flight. It's the moment you stop waiting for permission. And build your own sky. Frank Reynolds was standing in line at the hardware store, holding 2 cans of metallic silver spray paint and a roll of protective sheeting, when his phone buzzed with the kind of notification that didn't feel real at first. It wasn't from YouTube or Twitter this time, it was an email from a producer at a national news program. The subject line read, "We'd love to feature your story." Frank stared at it, squinting slightly as if the screen might change. He read it again. It wasn't spam. It was real. The producer had seen the video Mason posted of the final launch simulation. They were running a segment on unexpected visionaries, people who refused to let age define their limits, and they wanted Frank in the studio. Live. In New York City. He read the message a third time and felt something twist in his stomach. Mason, of course, was ecstatic. This is it. This is our Kennedy Space Center moment, he said, bouncing around the garage later that afternoon. Kyle smiled too, arms crossed, leaning casually against the rocket like it was a prop in a sci-fi movie. You gonna do it, Dad? Frank didn't answer right away. He looked at the Starship, now polished to a mirror sheen, the custom lights built into the fins reflecting the glow of the late afternoon sun. He had built something beautiful. He had gone viral. He had reunited with his son. And now, he was being asked to step onto a stage he never imagined, national television, coast to coast. And yet, there was a strange weight pressing on his chest. Frank had always been the kind of man who preferred the background, the engine room, the quiet certainty of building something with his hands rather than performing with his words. He wasn't sure he could explain what the rocket really meant without fumbling it, without sounding like a cliché, without losing the quiet dignity of what had driven him all these months. That night, as Mason snored softly on the living room couch and Kyle scrolled on his phone nearby, Frank stepped outside, sat on the porch swing, and called Emily. It had been a while since they'd spoken, but she picked up immediately. Dad? Hey sweetheart. Are you okay? I think so. You don't sound sure. He chuckled. You always were good at hearing between the lines. She waited. So he told her everything. The email, the invitation, the segment, the studio lights. When he was finished, there was a pause. Then, do you want to go? Frank hesitated. I don't know. I don't want to be a spectacle. This wasn't about fame. It was about remembering who I was. Her voice softened. Maybe sharing that could help someone else remember too. Frank let the words sink in. Maybe that was the point. Maybe this wasn't about performance, it was about permission. The kind that one voice, one story, could give another. The next morning, Frank sent the reply, "I'd be honored to participate. Let me know the details." Within hours, travel arrangements were made. Flights. Hotel. Studio prep. Kyle took the time off. Mason got permission from school. The three of them were going to New York City. Frank stood in front of the mirror the night before they left, trying on the only suit he owned, a navy blue number from Marlene's memorial that still held the faint scent of cedar and thyme. It was a little tight in the shoulders, a little loose at the waist, but it would do. He looked at himself and barely recognized the man staring back. Not because he looked older, but because he looked awake. The flight was uneventful. Mason was glued to the window, nose pressed against the glass during takeoff, shouting, "We have liftoff," as the plane climbed through the clouds. Kyle chuckled, earbuds in, while Frank sat quietly, gripping the armrests, not afraid of flying but thinking of something else entirely. How strange it was that this whole thing had started with a broken sketch pencil and a voice on a podcast. And now, here he was, 35,000 feet above the ground, carrying the story of his life in a carry-on bag and the weight of so many silent years in his chest. The hotel was fancy, too fancy for Frank's taste, shiny marble floors, staff with earpieces, elevators that talked to you in 3 languages. But Mason loved it. "We're basically astronauts now," he said, jumping on the bed. Frank just smiled. In the studio lobby the next morning, Frank met the producer, Julia, the same one from the SpaceX call. She was warm, professional, and clearly excited. "Frank, it's so good to finally meet you in person," she said. "People are really connecting with your story. You represent something we don't talk about enough." "What's that?" Frank asked. She smiled. "The second act." He nodded slowly. "Feels more like the third or fourth." "Even better," she said. The green room was buzzing with makeup artists, sound techs, and assistant producers checking their watches. Frank sat still as they powdered his forehead, adjusted his lapel mic, and gave him a bottle of water. Kyle sat nearby, occasionally giving a thumbs up. Mason, too young for the set, waited just off stage with a laminated badge and a huge grin. The host, a polished woman in her 40s with a practiced warmth, greeted Frank before they went live. "Big fan of the rocket," she said. "Even bigger fan of what it means." Frank swallowed hard, nodding. "Me too." Then the lights dimmed. The cameras rolled. The countdown began, not to a launch, but to something that, in its own way, felt just as powerful. The interview started simply. Name, age, retired profession. But quickly it shifted. The host asked him why he started building. What he hoped to accomplish. What it felt like to become an internet sensation at 68. Frank answered as honestly as he could. "I didn't build it to go viral. I built it because I didn't want to disappear. I think a lot of people my age feel like their story's over. I just wanted to prove to myself, and maybe to someone else, that we're still here. We still matter. We can still build something meaningful." The host leaned in. "And what would you say to someone watching right now who feels stuck? Who thinks it's too late?" Frank looked directly into the camera. "I'd say this, you're not done. You're just paused. You've still got something inside you that the world needs. So pick up the pencil. Open the toolbox. Make the call. Do the thing. Not for applause. But because you deserve to feel alive again." Silence. Then applause. Real applause. Backstage, Mason was crying. Kyle clapped so hard his hands turned red. Julia smiled, mouthing, "Nailed it." After the segment, viewers flooded the network's social media with comments. "That man made me cry before breakfast. I called my dad for the first time in years. When's the book coming out?" Frank didn't know what to say. He just sat in the dressing room afterward, staring at the mirror again. This time, the man looking back wasn't a stranger. It was him. The version that had always been there, just waiting to be remembered. That night, back in the hotel, Frank opened the commander's log and wrote, September 14th, studio interview complete. Spoke the truth. Didn't faint. Proud of that. Proud of all of it. He closed the notebook, walked to the window, and looked out over the glittering skyline of Manhattan. A city that never slept. A world that kept spinning. And in that moment, he understood something Elon had once said, something he'd written down months ago on a sticky note still stuck to the rocket back home: when something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. For Frank Reynolds, that something wasn't going to Mars. It was finding his way back to himself. And helping others believe they could too. Frank Reynolds woke up to a gray, drizzly morning in New York City, the kind of weather that made the bustling streets outside seem muted and distant. His hotel room window was fogged up, blurring the view of skyscrapers that reached into the low clouds. After yesterday's whirlwind, the interview, the applause, the flood of messages, he felt a strange mix of exhilaration and exhaustion. The rush of being seen, truly seen after so many years of feeling invisible, was thrilling. But beneath it all, a quiet worry lingered. Was this just a moment? A fleeting spark before the inevitable fade? Frank sat on the edge of the bed, sipping lukewarm coffee from the hotel cup, trying to steady his thoughts. Mason was still asleep on the fold-out couch, exhausted from the excitement. Kyle was out exploring the city, texting occasionally. Frank's phone buzzed with messages, emails from curious reporters, kind notes from strangers who had watched the interview, and a few unexpected messages from old friends and acquaintances reaching out after years of silence. But one message stood out, a direct message from a representative of a major aerospace company. They wanted to talk about partnering with Frank to develop a scaled version of his rocket project. Frank's heart raced. This was the kind of recognition he had never dared dream of, the kind Elon Musk himself might have dreamed of in the early days of SpaceX. Yet, as he read the carefully worded invitation to discuss collaboration, a deep unease settled over him. Partnering with a large corporation meant rules, contracts, deadlines, and probably losing the personal touch that had made his project so meaningful. It might mean losing control over the vision he and Mason had nurtured in their small garage. That afternoon, Kyle returned, eyes bright from city life but with a seriousness that mirrored Frank's own conflicted feelings. "Got your email," Kyle said as he dropped his jacket over a chair. "Big deal. What are you thinking?" Frank rubbed his forehead. "I don't know. It's an incredible opportunity, but I'm scared it'll change everything. That it'll turn into something I don't recognize." Kyle nodded thoughtfully. "That's valid. But sometimes change is part of the journey. Elon Musk didn't build SpaceX alone or overnight. He had to make deals, take risks, lose some things to gain others. I guess I always thought I'd finish this on my own terms," Frank said quietly. Mason came in, now fully awake and eager. "Guys, what if we say yes but keep it our way? We could negotiate creative control, keep the heart of the project intact." Frank smiled at Mason's youthful optimism. "You're a smart kid. Maybe that's the answer." Over the next few days, Frank navigated meetings with lawyers, executives, and engineers. The process was dizzying: terms and conditions, intellectual property rights, profit sharing. The corporate world moved fast, and Frank felt like he was learning a new language. But he also felt something else, an inner strength he hadn't known he had. He found himself channeling Elon's boldness, that refusal to accept limits. "If it's important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor," Frank repeated under his breath in meetings, reminding himself why he was doing this. As talks progressed, Frank faced his biggest test yet. The company wanted him to travel frequently to their headquarters, cut back on time with Mason and Kyle, and even modify the design to fit their commercial goals. It felt like a slow erosion of the dream he had fought to revive. One evening, alone in the hotel room, Frank sat staring at the Starship sketch taped to the wall, the original, rough lines now faint with age. He thought about Marlene's voice, Emily's advice, Kyle's support, and Mason's enthusiasm. Most of all, he thought about the reason he had started building in the first place. Not for fame or fortune, but for purpose, connection, and proof that age was not the end. The next morning, Frank made a decision. He called the company representative. "I appreciate the offer," he said firmly, "but I want to do this on my terms. If that means smaller, slower, but true to the vision, then that's what I'm going to do." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, surprisingly, the representative said, "I respect that. Let's find a way to make it work." Frank exhaled deeply, feeling a weight lift. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. Back at the garage, Mason and Kyle greeted him with hopeful smiles. "You did it," Mason said, eyes wide. "You stood your ground." Frank nodded, feeling more alive than he had in years. The rocket was more than metal and wires, it was a testament to resilience, to the power of refusing to give up, and to the unexpected journeys life can take when you say yes to yourself. As the rain finally stopped and a sliver of sunlight broke through the clouds, Frank knew this was just another beginning. Not the end of the story, but the start of a new chapter, one where age, dreams, and daring could all coexist. The countdown was on, but this time, it wasn't just for a rocket. It was for a life reignited. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Frank Reynolds stood in the cool morning air of the local community field, the grass still damp from an overnight rain that had left the earth smelling fresh and alive. The Starship prototype gleamed under the early sun, its silver body polished to a shine that caught every ray like a beacon. This was no longer just a dream sketched on scrap paper or a project cobbled together in a garage. It was real. Today was the day Mason had insisted on, the first official launch of their rocket, small scale but filled with all the hope and grit of 1,000 liftoffs yet to come. Friends and neighbors had gathered, a modest crowd of curious faces and supportive smiles. Some came out of genuine interest, others, like old Mr. Jenkins from down the street, came to poke fun but stayed silent, watching closely. Kyle adjusted the cameras, his usual laid-back demeanor replaced with a serious focus that mirrored Frank's own nervous excitement. Mason, barely able to contain himself, paced back and forth, clutching a clipboard with checklists and timelines he'd made in his teenage meticulousness. Frank felt the familiar knot in his stomach. The same one he'd felt before the big interview, before meetings with the aerospace company. But this was different. This was personal. This was their moment. As Frank moved to the control panel, fingers trembling slightly, memories flooded his mind. The first time he'd heard Elon Musk speak about SpaceX's bold vision for Mars. The countless nights alone, soldering wires, tweaking designs, fighting exhaustion. The phone call with Emily where she said, "You're never too old to surprise yourself." He glanced at Mason, whose eyes sparkled with the kind of belief only a child can have in a parent who dared to dream again. "Ready, Dad?" Mason whispered. Frank smiled, nodding. "Ready." The countdown began, a small speaker crackling the numbers into the crisp air, 10, 9, 8, each number felt like a heartbeat, building tension and anticipation. Neighbors leaned in, cameras raised, phones ready. 3, 2, 1, with a deep breath, Frank pressed the ignition button. For a moment, nothing happened. The crowd held its breath. Then, a small flame erupted from the rocket's base, a steady plume of fire and smoke lifting it inches from the ground. The Starship shuddered as the engines roared, and slowly, it ascended. Higher and higher, wobbling slightly but holding steady. Cheers erupted from the crowd, some stunned by the sight of a man in his late 60s launching a homemade rocket. Frank's heart pounded with a mix of pride and disbelief. As the rocket reached its peak, a gentle burst of parachutes deployed, slowing its descent back to Earth. It landed with a soft thud on a prepared landing pad. Mason ran forward, arms raised in victory. Frank joined him, feeling the sun warm his face and the cheers wash over him like a wave. The moment was perfect, fragile, and infinitely powerful. But even amid the joy, Frank felt the weight of what lay ahead. This launch was more than a test, it was a statement. To himself, to his family, to everyone who had written him off as too old, too tired, or too late. It was proof that hope could be engineered, that dreams could be rebuilt brick by brick. After the crowd dispersed, Frank stayed behind with Mason and Kyle, cleaning up and packing gear. The sky was now a bright blue canvas, the rocket resting like a silent promise on the grass. Kyle clapped Frank on the back. "You did it, Dad. This is just the start." Frank nodded, eyes on the horizon. "It better be." That night, back at home, Frank sat in his workshop, surrounded by blueprints, tools, and scraps of metal. The first launch was behind them, but his mind raced with possibilities. Elon Musk's words echoed in his memory, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." Frank realized it wasn't just about building a rocket anymore. It was about building a future. For Mason. For Kyle. For himself. And maybe for others who had forgotten how to believe in second chances. He reached for the notebook where he had been chronicling the journey, the failures, the small victories, the moments of doubt and strength. Tonight, he added a new entry, "First launch successful. Felt like flying again, not just the rocket, but me. This is what living feels like." As he closed the book, Frank knew one thing for sure, the path to Mars might be long and uncertain, but the journey to reclaim his life had already begun. And that was a launch worth celebrating. Frank Reynolds woke before dawn, the sky just beginning to lighten with the promise of a new day. The garage was cool and quiet except for the soft hum of the heater. He sat at his workbench, hands wrapped around a mug of black coffee, staring at the Starship prototype resting in the corner like a sleeping giant. The morning was peaceful, but Frank's mind wasn't. The glow of the recent launch still warmed him, but a shadow had crept into his thoughts, the voices of doubt. They weren't loud, but they were persistent. They came from everywhere, the skeptical neighbors who whispered that his rocket was a childish folly, the doctor who reminded him to take it easy, the distant family members who barely acknowledged his new passion, and even the quiet whispers in his own heart questioning if this was all worth it at his age. Frank rubbed his face and took a deep breath. "Who am I doing this for?" he whispered to the empty room. Was it Mason? Kyle? Himself? Or was it a stubborn refusal to fade into the background like so many before him? The phone buzzed with a new message, this time, a comment on the latest video Mason had uploaded. "You're too old to be building rockets. Just accept your place." Frank stared at the screen, the words feeling like a cold slap. He closed his eyes, recalling Elon Musk's own early struggles, countless setbacks, bankruptcy fears, and scoffing critics. Elon had said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." That phrase became a lifeline. Frank's hands tightened around the mug. He had a choice, let the doubt silence him or use it to fuel his fire. That day, Frank decided to confront the skepticism head-on. He arranged a small demonstration at the local community center, a chance to show, not just tell, what the rocket was about. Flyers went up, neighbors were invited, and Mason used social media to spread the word. When the day arrived, a modest crowd gathered, some curious, others skeptical. Frank stood in front of the rocket, heart pounding but voice steady. He began by sharing his story, his regrets, his lost dreams, and the spark that had reignited his passion. He spoke not just of rockets but of hope, resilience, and the courage to start over at any age. As he spoke, he saw faces soften, eyes brighten, and doubts begin to fade. The demonstration was simple, a scale model launch that Mason had built. As the tiny rocket soared, a cheer erupted. Among the crowd, an older woman approached Frank afterward. "I lost my husband last year," she said, voice trembling. "I thought I was done. But watching you reminded me it's never too late." Tears welled in Frank's eyes. That moment crystallized everything. This wasn't just about rockets. It was about people. It was about showing the world, and himself, that age was not a limit, but a chapter waiting to be written. That evening, as Frank sat with Kyle and Mason, he realized the real journey wasn't building a rocket to Mars. It was building a legacy of courage, connection, and relentless hope. The doubters were still there, but so was Frank's unshakable belief that sometimes, the most radical act is simply to keep dreaming. Frank Reynolds sat at the small kitchen table of his modest New York apartment, the late afternoon sun filtering through lace curtains and casting gentle patterns across worn wood. The quiet hum of the city outside was a steady backdrop to the swirl of thoughts in his mind. It had been weeks since the local demonstration, and something had shifted, not just in the community, but deep inside him. The rocket project was no longer just a personal quest, it was becoming a beacon that connected him to people he hadn't seen or heard from in years. One name had been lingering in his thoughts more than any other: Emily. His daughter. Since his wife Marlene had passed, Frank and Emily's relationship had grown distant, stretched thin by years of unspoken regrets and missed chances. Emily, busy with her own life in Seattle, had always thought Frank too stubborn, too caught up in what she called futile dreams. Frank knew he had hurt her with his absence, his quiet retreat into himself, and the crushing weight of loss that he never fully shared. But now, inspired by Elon Musk's relentless pursuit of the impossible, Frank felt ready to reach out. He pulled out his phone and stared at Emily's number. His fingers hovered over the screen, heart pounding with a mixture of hope and fear. What if she didn't respond? What if she was still angry? After a long pause, he typed a simple message: "Hi Emily. I'm building a rocket. I'd love to tell you about it someday." He hit send before doubt could silence him. The wait was agonizing. Days passed with no reply, each silence stretching longer than the last. But then, one evening, his phone buzzed. Emily's name flashed on the screen. "Dad, I saw your video. This is incredible. Maybe we can talk." Frank felt a rush of warmth, a fragile bridge forming where there had been distance. They agreed to a video call the next day. When Emily's face appeared on the screen, Frank saw traces of his own features, her eyes cautious but curious, her smile hesitant but real. They talked for hours. Frank shared his journey, the fears and hopes behind the rocket. Emily opened up about her struggles, the pressures of her job, the loneliness she sometimes felt. The conversation wasn't perfect, but it was honest. It was a start. Over the following weeks, their calls became more frequent. Emily sent Frank articles about space exploration, and Frank shared updates on the rocket's progress. She even surprised him by offering to visit the garage. When Emily arrived, she found not just a man chasing an old dream, but a father transformed, full of passion, determination, and vulnerability. Watching Frank work with Mason and Kyle, seeing the light in his eyes, Emily felt something shift inside her. Maybe this was more than just a hobby. Maybe it was proof that reinvention was possible, no matter the scars or years lost. Together, they began repairing the fragile bond time had frayed. Frank realized that just as the rocket needed fuel and guidance, so did his relationship with Emily. It was a process of patience, forgiveness, and daring to hope again. That night, after Emily left, Frank sat alone in the quiet kitchen, the glow from the street lamps casting long shadows. He thought about Elon Musk's fearless drive to challenge the impossible, and how that spirit had sparked not only a rocket launch but a chance to mend what once seemed broken beyond repair. Frank smiled softly. He wasn't just building a legacy of steel and fire, he was rebuilding family, one brave step at a time. Frank Reynolds felt a knot tighten in his stomach as he stood beside the rocket prototype in the workshop. The air smelled faintly of burnt metal and solder, a scent he had come to associate with progress and possibility. But today, the smell felt different, heavy with disappointment. The tests they had run yesterday had revealed a critical flaw in the fuel delivery system, a miscalculation that could cause catastrophic failure during launch. Mason's face was pale as he reviewed the data on his laptop, his youthful enthusiasm dampened by the weight of the problem. "Dad, this could delay everything by months," Mason said quietly. Frank swallowed hard. The dream they had nurtured so carefully, the painstaking months of work, suddenly felt fragile, as if it could shatter at any moment. He thought of Elon Musk, who had faced countless setbacks with SpaceX, from failed rockets to financial ruin. Elon's words echoed in his mind, "Failure is an option here. If things are not failing, you are not innovating enough." But knowing this intellectually was one thing, living it was another. Frank felt the sting of self-doubt creep in. Was he too old for this? Was the dream slipping through his fingers? That evening, as the city lights flickered outside the garage window, Frank sat alone, the silence pressing in. He reflected on the journey so far, the launch, the community support, the rekindled relationship with Emily. All of it seemed so distant now, overshadowed by this new hurdle. Yet, beneath the frustration, a small spark of resolve glowed. He reached for his notebook and began to write, channeling his thoughts into words. Setbacks aren't the end. They're the tests that separate those who quit from those who push forward. The next morning, Frank gathered Mason and Kyle. "We're going to fix this," he said firmly. "Not because it's easy, but because it matters." The team dove into problem-solving mode, researching, redesigning, and testing late into the nights. Frank marveled at the blend of youthful energy and seasoned patience that powered their effort. It reminded him of Elon Musk's relentless innovation, never settling, always iterating. Weeks passed in a blur of trial and error. There were moments of frustration, of feeling overwhelmed by the complexity. Yet, each small success, an improved valve here, a better pressure gauge there, rekindled their hope. One evening, Emily visited the garage again, bringing warm soup and encouragement. "You remind me of my dad when he was building his company," she said, eyes shining with pride. "He always said, if you're not failing, you're not trying hard enough. You're on the right path." Frank smiled, gratitude swelling in his chest. Her support was a balm, a reminder that this journey was bigger than one man's dream. It was a shared pursuit of meaning, connection, and courage. Finally, the day came to retest the fuel system. The atmosphere was tense, each member of the team holding their breath as Frank initiated the test sequence. Slowly, the gauges stabilized. No leaks, no pressure drops. The system held steady. Cheers erupted in the small garage, laughter mingling with tears of relief. Frank felt a surge of triumph, not just over the technical hurdle but over the doubts that had threatened to consume him. This setback had tested more than their engineering skills, it had tested their spirit. And they had passed. As the night deepened and the team packed up, Frank looked up at the stars visible through the garage window. Somewhere out there, Elon Musk was probably watching his own rockets soar and fall, knowing that every failure was a step closer to success. Frank whispered into the quiet, "We're not done yet. This is just the beginning." The morning light poured through the dusty windows of the workshop, casting long shadows over tools and scattered blueprints. Frank Reynolds was hunched over the control panel of the Starship prototype, fine-tuning the navigation system they had painstakingly redesigned after the fuel setback. His hands moved with steady confidence now, fingers tracing circuits and screens, a quiet rhythm born from months of relentless effort. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up, birds chirping, cars humming, life moving on as it always did. But inside that small garage, time seemed to pause. This was more than just a project. It was the rebirth of a man who had once believed he was done. Suddenly, the phone buzzed on the workbench, its screen lighting up with an unfamiliar number. Frank wiped his hands on his jeans and answered. "Hello." A clear, professional voice responded, "Mr. Reynolds. This is Lisa Harper from Space Tech News. We came across your recent launch video, and were interested in featuring your story. Frank blinked, stunned. Feature? Like in a story? Yes, sir. Your project and your journey are inspiring. We think it will resonate with many, especially those who feel it's too late to dream. He glanced at Mason, who had just walked in. This is incredible, Mason breathed. The call ended with arrangements for a local interview the following week. Frank sat back, a swell of emotions rising. Recognition. Validation. Hope. The following days were a whirlwind. Lisa arrived with her camera crew, setting up in the cluttered garage. Frank spoke candidly about his late start, his fears, and his newfound purpose inspired by Elon Musk's fearless mindset. He talked about Mason and Kyle, about Emily and the road to forgiveness. He even shared the setbacks, the failures that had almost broken him. The crew captured it all, painting a portrait of resilience and reinvention that Frank never imagined possible. When the feature aired, the response was overwhelming. Calls and messages poured in from strangers across the country, older adults inspired to start new ventures, families reconnecting, dreamers reignited. The local newspaper ran a front-page story titled, "From Garage to Galaxy, A Man's Mission to Mars." At the grocery store, neighbors who had once doubted stopped to shake Frank's hand. Old Mr. Jenkins nodded with a newfound respect. Even the doctor who had warned him to slow down smiled knowingly. But amid the acclaim, Frank remained grounded. He knew the journey was far from over. The recognition was a spark, not the flame itself. That evening, as Frank sat with Emily and Mason around the dinner table, he felt a profound sense of peace. The rocket prototype stood nearby, gleaming under the garage light, a symbol not just of ambition but of rebirth. Elon Musk's words echoed in his mind, a steady beacon, persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. Frank smiled, the weight of years lifting. He was no longer waiting for permission to matter. He was already making his mark, one bold step, one small victory at a time. The momentum from the feature story energized Frank Reynolds in ways he hadn't expected. Every morning as he walked into the garage, the feeling was different, lighter, more electric, charged with possibility. The modest workshop, cluttered with tools and star charts, had transformed from a private sanctuary into a hub of inspiration, not only for Frank but for Mason, Kyle, and even Emily. The community's newfound interest brought a steady stream of visitors, curious neighbors, local journalists, and sometimes complete strangers who saw Frank's journey as a beacon of hope. It was overwhelming at times, but Frank embraced it. He knew this was the ripple effect Elon Musk had talked about, how one bold vision could spark a wave of change. Mason had taken it upon himself to launch a crowdfunding campaign to help with materials and testing. Kyle worked tirelessly on refining the rocket software, his passion fueling late-night coding sessions that filled the small space with the soft glow of computer screens. Emily, once distant, was now more involved than ever, offering ideas and connecting Frank with contacts from her tech world. One afternoon, Frank received an email from a university aerospace professor expressing interest in collaborating on the project. The offer was unexpected but exciting, validation from experts who recognized the potential in their humble Starship prototype. Yet, despite the growing support, Frank remained vigilant. The setbacks they had faced reminded him that the road ahead would be anything but smooth. He was determined not to let early success breed complacency. The team set a new goal, a larger-scale launch that would test the rocket's capabilities beyond what they'd attempted before. Preparation was meticulous. Blueprints were revised, components double-checked, safety measures heightened. The workshop buzzed with activity, a blend of focused work and hopeful chatter. Frank often caught himself watching Mason with a proud smile. The boy had grown into a young man whose eyes reflected the same fire Frank once had in his youth. Together, they were proving that age wasn't a barrier to dreams, but a foundation to build upon. One evening, as Frank sat reviewing notes, a news alert flashed across his phone. SpaceX was preparing for another Starship test flight. The image of Elon Musk appeared on the screen, speaking about pushing boundaries and the relentless pursuit of progress. Frank felt a kinship with that vision, as if Elon's own journey was a silent cheer urging him forward. That night, he shared the moment with Mason and Emily. The three of them huddled around the screen, feeling the shared pulse of a dream that spanned generations. "We're part of something bigger," Frank said quietly. "Not just a rocket to Mars, but a message, that it's never too late to reach for the stars." As the days grew longer and the launch date approached, Frank felt a mix of nerves and exhilaration. This was more than a test, it was proof of what resilience, courage, and a little bit of Elon-inspired audacity could achieve. Whatever happened next, Frank knew one thing for certain: he was no longer waiting for permission to matter. He was already soaring. The dawn arrived crisp and clear, painting the sky with soft shades of pink and orange as Frank Reynolds stood at the edge of the makeshift launch pad behind his small New York home. The air was thick with anticipation, the faint scent of earth and morning dew mingling with the subtle metallic tang of the Starship prototype standing tall and gleaming under the first light. Months of preparation had led to this moment. A test flight that could either cement their progress or expose new challenges to overcome. Frank's hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of everything riding on this launch. Mason and Kyle moved efficiently around the rocket, checking gauges, securing panels, their youthful energy a stark contrast to Frank's seasoned patience. Emily was nearby, capturing the moment on her phone, a supportive smile that masked her own nerves. Frank thought of Elon Musk's voice from countless interviews, his relentless belief in pushing through failures toward success. When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor. Those words had fueled Frank's fire from the beginning, and now they echoed louder than ever. The countdown began, whispered over the radios, a steady rhythm that seemed to sync with Frank's heartbeat. 10, 9, 8. The neighborhood was unusually quiet, neighbors drawn outside to watch, some whispering words of encouragement. 5, 4, 3. Frank's breath slowed, his eyes fixed on the rocket's base as the ignition sequence initiated. 2, 1. Suddenly, a burst of flame and smoke erupted from the engine bell, the Starship shuddering with the force of its own power. It rose slowly at first, wobbling slightly as the team held their breath, then steadied, climbing higher into the sky. Cheers erupted from the small crowd gathered, neighbors and friends united in awe. Frank felt tears prick his eyes as the rocket pierced the morning sky, a tangible symbol of hope, courage, and the refusal to fade quietly into the background. The flight lasted only minutes, but those minutes carried a lifetime of meaning. The rocket's successful ascent was followed by a smooth descent and landing in the open field nearby, a testament to the countless hours of work and the unyielding spirit behind it. As the team rushed to inspect the prototype, Frank's phone buzzed with messages: congratulations from Emily's friends, a supportive tweet from a local politician, even a brief note from an engineer at SpaceX who had seen their video. The sense of accomplishment was profound, but Frank knew this was just one step on a longer journey. That evening, gathered around the kitchen table with Mason, Kyle, and Emily, Frank allowed himself a rare moment of reflection. This was more than a launch, he said softly. It was a statement. That age doesn't define us. That we're capable of more than we think. Emily reached across and squeezed his hand. You've inspired me, Dad. Not just with the rocket, but with everything you've overcome. Frank smiled, feeling a warmth that no success alone could bring. The path ahead was still uncertain, full of unknowns and challenges, but the fire within him burned brighter than ever. Elon Musk's bold vision for Mars had sparked a personal revolution in Frank, a journey from doubt to daring, from silence to voice. And as the stars twinkled overhead that night, Frank made a silent vow, to keep reaching, keep building, keep dreaming, because the greatest journeys often begin when you decide you're not done yet. The glow of the launch success still warmed Frank Reynolds' heart, but the days that followed brought a new, harsher reality. Social media comments, once filled with encouragement, began to include skeptics questioning the feasibility of a backyard rocket. Too old to start, one post sneered. Why waste time on childish fantasies, another said. Even some acquaintances in town whispered doubts behind his back. Frank felt the sting of judgment, the familiar ache of being misunderstood. It was as if the world was reminding him that age, experience, and passion were not enough to break through. Mason noticed the change. Don't listen to them, Dad. They don't see what you see. But the words didn't fully soothe the gnawing self-doubt creeping in during quiet moments. One afternoon, Emily found Frank sitting alone in the workshop, staring at the rocket's worn blueprints. "What's on your mind?" she asked softly. He sighed. "Sometimes I wonder if it's worth it. If this dream is just a fool's errand." Emily shook her head. "You've come this far. You're proving that age isn't a cage. That's powerful. Don't let their voices drown out yours." Frank nodded, grateful yet unsettled. That night, he turned to the one source of inspiration that had never failed him, Elon Musk's interviews. Elon's words rang clear: the first step is to establish that something is possible, then probability will occur. It was a reminder that visionaries often faced ridicule before success. Armed with renewed resolve, Frank decided to face the critics head-on. He organized a community event at the local library, a presentation about their Starship project, the setbacks, the triumphs, and the deeper meaning behind it all. The room was modest but packed with curious faces, neighbors, reporters, even a few skeptics. Frank spoke with raw honesty, sharing not just the technical details but the emotional journey, his fears, regrets, and the courage to try again despite it all. He quoted Elon Musk, who had once said, "When something is important enough, you do it even if the odds are not in your favor." The audience was silent, captivated by the vulnerability and strength intertwined in his story. After the talk, hands raised with questions, some skeptical, others supportive. Frank answered each with calm and conviction. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted from doubt to admiration. A local teacher approached him afterward. "You've shown us all that it's never too late to dream big. Thank you for that." The words settled in Frank's heart like a bomb. Returning home that evening, Frank felt lighter. The critics would always exist, but so would the truth of his journey. He was not defined by others' limits but by his own courage. Mason and Emily greeted him with smiles, their belief in him unwavering. Frank realized that facing criticism was part of the path, an obstacle, yes, but also a chance to deepen his resolve and inspire others to do the same. Elon Musk's boldness had taught him that true innovation and transformation often require standing firm against the noise. Frank whispered to himself, "I'm not done yet. Not by a long shot." The weeks following the community event brought unexpected change in Frank Reynolds' personal life. The ripple effect of his openness and determination began to touch not just strangers but those closest to him. One afternoon, as Frank was calibrating the navigation system on the Starship prototype, the doorbell rang. He wiped his hands on a rag and opened the door to see his son, David, standing hesitantly on the porch. David's face was weathered by years and regret, but his eyes held a cautious hope. Frank's heart tightened. They had drifted apart after his divorce from Mary over a decade ago, years filled with silence and missed birthdays. "Dad," David said quietly, "I've been watching. I saw the story on the news. I didn't realize how much you were still fighting." Frank stepped aside, motioning for him to come in. The garage felt charged with the hum of machines and dreams. As they sat amidst the blueprints and tools, Frank shared the journey, the setbacks, the victories, and the inspiration drawn from Elon Musk's fearless mindset. David listened, the walls between them starting to crumble. "I'm sorry for not being there," David admitted, voice thick with emotion. "I thought you were done. That you didn't want me around." Frank reached out, gripping his son's hand. "I was waiting for a sign that it wasn't too late, for both of us." The conversation stretched into hours, unearthing years of pain but also planting seeds of hope. David promised to be part of this new chapter, eager to learn and contribute. Over the next weeks, David became a regular presence in the workshop, his mechanical skills a welcome addition to the team. The act of building the Starship together mended broken bridges, healing wounds through shared purpose. Emily noticed the change too. "It's like your family's coming back to life," she said one evening as they watched David and Mason collaborate on a new engine component. Frank smiled, feeling the warmth of belonging that had seemed lost. The rekindling of family bonds gave new meaning to his mission, not just a quest to reach Mars, but a journey to reconnect with the people who mattered most. Frank often thought of Elon Musk's own story. How personal struggles had shaped his vision and resilience. He realized that transformation wasn't only about rockets or innovation, it was about human connection and the courage to start again. One night, as the three generations sat around a small fire pit in the backyard, Frank raised his glass. "To new beginnings," he said, eyes shining. "And to proving that it's never too late to change." They clinked glasses, the crackling flames reflecting in their faces, a symbol of hope, forgiveness, and the power of daring to believe again. Frank Reynolds sat quietly in the workshop late into the evening, the soft hum of machinery a comforting soundtrack to his thoughts. The Starship prototype stood nearby, its sleek form bathed in the glow of overhead lamps, a testament to years of sweat, setbacks, and stubborn hope. The journey had changed him deeply. No longer the man who felt invisible, forgotten by time, Frank now carried within him a fierce sense of purpose that pulsed stronger with each passing day. The rekindled connection with David and the support of Mason and Emily had woven a new tapestry of family and friendship around his life. Yet, the dream was far from complete. Elon Musk's words echoed in his mind, "Some people don't like change, but you need to embrace change if the alternative is disaster." Frank knew embracing change meant preparing for the next big step, their first full-scale flight test beyond the neighborhood launch pad. They had secured funding through local grants and the crowdfunding campaign had brought in enough for advanced materials and safety systems. Now came the real challenge, building a rocket capable of reaching the edge of the atmosphere, a step closer to the stars. The workshop buzzed with renewed energy. Mason and Kyle worked side by side, engineering parts with precision, while David applied his mechanical skills to streamline the assembly process. Emily coordinated outreach efforts, connecting with local schools and media to share their story and inspire others. Frank felt a surge of pride watching the team, a blend of generations united by a common dream. The community's support continued to grow. Neighbors volunteered time and resources, schools organized visits to the workshop, and local officials expressed interest in turning the project into a broader STEM initiative. Frank realized their Starship had become more than a rocket. It was a symbol of resilience, innovation, and the power of dreaming beyond limits. One crisp morning, as the team assembled the final components, Frank paused to look out at the horizon, the sky a vast canvas of possibility. He thought back to the day he first watched Elon Musk's Starship launch attempts, the doubt he felt, and the spark that ignited within him to defy expectations. Now, standing on the cusp of their own breakthrough, he understood that the true journey was not just about rockets or Mars, it was about reclaiming agency over his life and inspiring others to do the same. As the sun climbed higher, Frank gathered the team. "This next flight," he said, voice steady, "is for everyone who's ever felt too old, too broken, or too forgotten. We're showing the world that it's never too late to reach for the stars." The day of the launch was set for early fall. Plans were made with meticulous care, safety protocols, live streaming arrangements, and community events to coincide with the test. As the countdown approached, Frank's heart swelled with a mix of nerves and pride. Whatever happened, this project had already transformed his life and countless others. In the quiet moments before ignition, Frank looked up at the sky and whispered, "Thank you, Elon, for showing me that boldness knows no age." The engines roared to life, the Starship lifted with power and grace, climbing higher than ever before, an emblem of courage, resilience, and the limitless possibilities that come when you refuse to give up. And as the rocket soared toward that new horizon, Frank knew deep in his heart, this was just the beginning. The night after the successful full-scale flight test was quiet but electric. Frank Reynolds sat alone in his workshop, the Starship prototype resting nearby like a silent sentinel, its metal gleaming under the soft glow of the overhead lamp. Outside, the world seemed to breathe with a newfound rhythm. Neighbors had gathered earlier for a small celebration, and messages of support and congratulations still pinged on his phone. Frank's heart was full, not just from the triumph of the launch, but from the journey that had led him here, from the darkest moments when he felt invisible, forgotten by time, to this new chapter bursting with life, purpose, and connection. The memories flooded back, the lonely kitchens, the missed birthdays, the skepticism that had once threatened to smother his dreams. Yet, it was Elon Musk's relentless spirit, his fearless defiance of limits, that had sparked a transformation in Frank. He remembered the words that had carried him through: persistence is very important. You should not give up unless you are forced to give up. And Frank had refused to give up. His phone buzzed again, a video call from David. "Dad, I just wanted to say thanks," David said, eyes bright. "For showing me it's never too late to change, to rebuild. You've given me a second chance too." Frank smiled, voice thick with emotion. "We're in this together, son. This is only the beginning." As the call ended, Frank reflected on the legacy he was leaving, not just the rocket or the technical achievements, but the message that courage and purpose are ageless. Mason entered the workshop, holding a small framed photo of the team on launch day. "We've inspired a lot of people, Dad. Schools want to set up workshops, the local paper's running a series on late bloomers. People are starting to believe again." Frank nodded, feeling a deep peace. "That's the real mission," he said. "To remind everyone, especially those who think time has passed them by, that they still matter. That they still have something to give." Emily joined them, her eyes shining. "Your story has touched so many, Dad. You were never too old. You were just waiting for permission to matter again." Frank looked at the faces around him, young and old, connected by a shared dream and the power of reinvention. He realized that the journey had changed not only his life but had sparked a ripple of hope that extended far beyond his little workshop. That night, as Frank stepped outside and gazed up at the stars, he felt a profound gratitude. The vastness above no longer intimidated him, it invited him forward. With every heartbeat, he knew the future was wide open, full of promise, discovery, and the unyielding belief that boldness has no age limit. Elon Musk's vision to colonize Mars had sparked Frank's personal revolution. A reminder that the greatest journeys often begin when we decide we're not done yet. Frank whispered to the night sky, "This is just the beginning. The best is yet to come." And with that, he turned back inside, ready to face whatever new adventures awaited, carrying with him the unshakable truth: it's never too late to change, to build, to soar. The morning sun streamed through the garage windows, casting long golden beams across the Starship prototype that now stood as a symbol not just of dreams realized but of horizons yet to be reached. Frank Reynolds moved around the workshop with steady purpose, his hands steady, his mind sharp, and his spirit soaring higher than ever before. The successful full-scale flight had opened doors Frank never imagined possible. Invitations to speak at local schools, interviews with community newspapers, and offers from aerospace clubs had flooded in. Yet, Frank felt something stirring deeper inside. A restless pull toward what lay beyond Earth, beyond the familiar. The idea of Mars, once a distant, almost mythical destination, now felt within reach, like a calling whispered on the winds of possibility. Elon Musk's vision had always been about more than just rockets. It was about pushing humanity forward, about leaving a legacy of exploration and courage that defied limitations. Frank found himself poring over new materials, sketches of improved engines, and even discussions about sustainable life support systems, ideas that had seemed far-fetched months ago. Mason, now more confident and skilled, eagerly absorbed every lesson Frank shared, their bond stronger than ever. David, too, had embraced this new chapter, bringing his technical expertise to the team and even helping coordinate with local STEM initiatives to inspire young minds. One afternoon, Emily brought a surprising announcement. "Frank, there's interest from a regional university's aerospace department. They want to collaborate on developing life support modules for long-duration space flights. They've heard about your work and want to get involved." Frank felt a swell of pride. This was no longer just a personal project, it was becoming a community movement, a collective leap toward the stars. "Let's make it happen," he said, his voice steady with determination. As weeks turned into months, the workshop evolved from a modest garage to a bustling hub of innovation. The Starship prototype was upgraded with new technology, and plans were drafted for a series of increasingly ambitious tests, each step bringing them closer to the dream of Mars colonization. Frank often thought back to the early days when he doubted himself, when the fear of age and failure threatened to keep him grounded. Now, surrounded by a team bound by passion and purpose, he felt a profound gratitude for the journey, every struggle, every triumph, every moment of doubt that had been transformed into fuel for forward motion. One evening, after a long day of work, Frank sat outside on the porch, gazing up at the vast night sky. The stars shimmered like distant beacons, reminders of the infinite possibilities waiting just beyond reach. Mason joined him, handing over a cup of coffee. "Do you ever get scared?" Mason asked quietly. Frank smiled, his eyes never leaving the heavens. "All the time. But fear isn't a stop sign, it's a signal to be brave." Mason nodded, inspired. "I want to help build that future. To be part of something bigger." Frank placed a hand on his shoulder. "And you will. We all will. Because this isn't just about rockets or Mars. It's about showing the world that no matter how old you are, you can still dream, still build, still change." That night, Frank sent a message to a community forum he had started, encouraging others to share their stories of reinvention and hope. The responses poured in, tales of people rediscovering passions, overcoming doubts, and daring to step into new chapters of life. The movement was growing, fueled by the simple truth Frank had learned: age is not a limitation but a platform. As the years unfolded, Frank's workshop became a beacon of inspiration far beyond his neighborhood. Schools partnered with them to introduce students to aerospace engineering. Local businesses supported their efforts, and even national media began to spotlight their story as a testament to resilience and innovation at any age. Elon Musk's dream to colonize Mars had ignited Frank's own revolution, one that transcended rockets and technology to touch the very heart of what it means to grow, change, and dare greatly. Standing on the threshold of this new frontier, Frank knew the journey was far from over. But for the first time in a long time, he was certain of one thing: the stars were no longer just distant points of light. They were destinations waiting to be reached, and he, along with those he loved and inspired, would be among the pioneers daring to get there. And so, with the night sky stretched wide above him and a team of dreamers by his side, Frank whispered a promise to the universe: this is just the beginning. The best is yet to come. Frank Reynolds stood at the edge of the launch field, the crisp morning air carrying a hint of anticipation and possibility. The Starship prototype, now a symbol of years of perseverance and dreams reborn, stood tall against the blue sky, a monument not just to technology, but to human spirit and relentless courage. Today marked a milestone far greater than any previous test. This launch wasn't simply about breaking records or reaching higher altitudes. It was about crossing a threshold, between doubt and belief, between the confines of age and the boundless possibilities of reinvention. Frank's heart pounded, a rhythmic drum echoing the journey that had brought him here. He thought back to the lonely moments, the days filled with quiet despair, when he wondered if he'd ever matter again. Then, he remembered Elon Musk's bold vision, how it had sparked a fire inside him to defy limitations and dream bigger than fear allowed. Around him, the team moved with focused energy. Mason adjusting the final sensors, David coordinating communications, Emily organizing press, and community members gathered for support. Each person carried a piece of the dream, their efforts woven into the fabric of this moment. The crowd was larger than ever, neighbors, students, reporters, even some skeptics turned believers, all drawn to witness a story of hope and transformation unfolding before their eyes. Frank felt the weight of their expectations, but also their faith. He stepped to the microphone to address the gathered crowd. This journey started as a way to prove to myself that it's never too late to dream, to build, and to change. Today, we take one step closer to the stars, not just for me, but for everyone who's ever been told they're too old or too late. This is our final frontier, not just outer space, but the space within us where boldness lives. The countdown began. Engines roared to life, shaking the ground beneath their feet. The Starship rose, steady and powerful, cutting through the sky with grace and determination. Cheers erupted from the crowd, tears of joy mingling with applause. As the rocket climbed higher, Frank felt a surge of hope ripple through him, hope that transcended his personal story to touch the hearts of countless others. The launch was flawless, the prototype reaching an altitude that surpassed all prior attempts. For a moment, time seemed to pause, suspended between Earth and the vast unknown. When the Starship returned safely, the cheers turned to celebration, a testament to what can be achieved with courage, persistence, and belief. In the days that followed, Frank's story spread nationwide, an inspiring beacon for those who felt left behind by time. Invitations came for speaking engagements, collaborations, and new projects aimed at empowering older adults to pursue their passions. But for Frank, the greatest legacy was personal. It was in the restored bond with his family, the friendship of his team, and the community that had rallied around a shared dream. Sitting quietly one evening, Frank reflected, I was never too old. I was just waiting for permission to matter again. Elon Musk's vision had lit the path, but Frank's journey had proven that the boldness to change lies within each of us, regardless of age or circumstance. As the stars twinkled overhead, Frank knew this was more than an ending. It was a beginning, a legacy of hope, courage, and the unshakable belief that the final frontier is not a place in space, but the limitless potential within us all. And with that, Frank smiled, ready to embrace whatever new adventures the future held, knowing that with boldness and heart, anything was possible. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?